So The Flash, it's finally here after being announced all the way back in... Jesus. You know, I remember when Ezra Miller was cast as Barry Allen. It was back in 2014, and it was just after the Flash TV series with Grant Gustin aired its second episode. I mean, Christ, you couldn't have waited a bit? Give Grant Gustin a few episodes before you announce another actor playing the same role? Just A1 coordination there between the Warner Brothers movie division and the TV department. So anyway, the reason I bring this up is that the Flash TV series starring Grant Gustin just finished its 9th and final season. I just think it's funny that from when Ezra Miller was cast till now, the production staff working on the Flash TV series managed to comfortably crank out 9 seasons of a show starring the same character before Warner Brothers managed to get this film out. And doesn't that just say a lot about the Warner Brothers film division and what a total mess they've been for over 10 years now? Anyway, The Flash. I caught this film at my local cinema over a week ago and I loved it. No lie, I really loved it. And I'm kind of surprised that so many critics have gone as hard on it as they have. For me, The Flash is a superhero film that feels genuine. It feels creative and heartfelt, and made by people that actually care about these characters and this world, and that's something I feel I'm seeing less and less of lately. More than anything, The Flash feels like a superhero comic book film. Well, what do I mean by that? This is a film where Barry Allen, the Flash, goes back in time to stop the murder of his mom, only to completely alter the timeline and then have to prevent the terraforming events from Man of Steel occurring by teaming up with Michael Keaton's Batman from the Batman '89 movie and Supergirl, not Superman here because he's already dead in this reality. This is the most comic book storyline ever, and I love it. You see, I had high hopes going into this. I was excited to see Keaton back. I was looking forward to seeing more of Affleck. I was interested to see this new take on Supergirl, and just generally I thought the film had a pretty cool premise, a kind of loose adaptation of the Flashpoint comic book storyline. This was the stuff I was excited about. The one thing I wasn't really pumped up about though was Ezra Miller's Flash, and I sure as hell wasn't excited about getting a double dose of Miller's Barry Allen in this film. I've just never been a fan of Miller's portrayal of this character. Barry Allen in these films has always just been irritating and kind of grating. Like if you knew this version of Barry Allen in real life, you'd be actively trying to avoid speaking with him. This was the biggest worry for me going into this film, and I'm happy to say apparently it's not something I should have ever worried about. This film did the impossible for me. It made me not hate Ezra Miller's Flash, and actually made me root for this version of Barry Allen. Believe me, I'm as surprised by this as you are. Barry Allen actually works here. He's an actual character, and not just some cipher that spits out unfunny comments about brunch and has forced lame interactions with other characters like in Justice League. Here Barry gets a lot more to do. Here you're seeing him deal with his own problems. You're seeing what motivates him. He's not just a comic relief character here, although that's still a large aspect of his character, but he's not just a total joke either. He's fleshed out, he's a three-dimensional character, and man, if ever a character needed this treatment, it was Ezra Miller's Flash. Don't get me wrong though, it will never not irk me that Barry Allen, one of the greatest comic book characters of all time, the guy who sacrificed his life during the Crisis on Infinite Earths, the hero that other heroes actually look up to, is now the quirky comic relief character in this version of the Justice League. But here the writers found a way to balance the forced comic relief side that this version of the character had to have for some reason, with the more serious side the character has in the comics. It's not the Barry Allen you know from the books, not at all. It's not even close. There's still some dialogue in there that just doesn't land, but for the most part it works. It goes a long way towards making this version of Barry Allen likable, where he was almost unbearable before. Would I have liked a more comic book accurate version of Barry? 100% yes, I would. But since we don't have that here, it's one of those situations where you just have to say, okay, this isn't really anything like Barry Allen. This is basically just a totally new character that happens to have the same guy's name. The portrayal worked for me, not saying that it will for everyone. I think the mileage will vary for a lot of people. I actually think this film will live or die for some people based on how much of Ezra Miller's Barry Allen's, I guess, they can tolerate. It's funny that to get this version of Barry over, the writers had to play him off a younger, more annoying version of himself. Almost like the director was saying, hey, this version of Barry Allen is kind of annoying, right? But could have been a hell of a lot worse. Two versions of Ezra Miller's Barry Allen playing off each other actually work surprisingly well here. It's a good dynamic, and it's a clever way of showing some character growth for Barry Allen, showing an approximation of how he might have been and the guy he is now who's a lot more responsible. All that stuff in the news about them aside, Ezra Miller is a talented actor, and even seeing how they play two different versions of the same character here shows the range they're capable of. Outside of the quirky comedy stuff, the quieter, more emotional scenes in this film are really well handled by Miller. This one scene at the end where Barry has to go back in time and basically let his mom die, it's really touching, and Miller really sells you on it. When Barry has to take that can of tomatoes out of the trolley, it looks like it's taking everything he's got to do it. It's just such a really well acted scene from Miller, and also from Maribel Verdú, who plays Nora Allen, Barry's mom. She's also great in this, by the way. So hands down, Michael Keaton's Batman was the biggest draw for me about this film, and he delivers 100%. He's easily the best part of the film, stealing every scene he's in. It's not exactly the same Batman from Batman 89 and Returns, canonically speaking, but it's so close as to basically be the same guy. Keaton just gets right back into it, like Batman Returns was only released last year and not 30 years ago. The action scenes with Keaton's Batman here are pretty much the best in the whole film. It's a lot of CGI as well, but it works, and it's great seeing this version of Batman just stomping on guys and using his gadgets in a way that he couldn't back in the original films due to the limitations of the suit. I would have liked if we got more character development for this version of Bruce Wayne though. When we get the introduction of Keaton's Batman about halfway through the film, he's been retired for a long time. The reason given for this is that Gotham didn't need Batman anymore because he managed to clean it up, and it's now one of the safest cities in America. I think the writers fell down a little bit here. There was real potential here for exploring why Bruce Wayne stopped being Batman, and had they developed this angle a little bit more, I think it would have gone a long way towards giving this version of Batman a really satisfying arc in the film. Here's an example of something the writers could have done instead. Explain that Bruce stopped being Batman because he failed to prevent the death of someone he cared about, and he just couldn't put the suit on anymore. Let's say one of his rogues gallery killed Selina Kyle years ago, and he's just been in isolation ever since dealing with his grief. If the writers went with this idea, then Batman's death fighting Non at the end would have more resonance because he died protecting people he cared about where he failed before. Something small like that goes a really long way, and you don't even need to show it via flashbacks. You can do the whole thing via expository dialogue when all the characters are sitting around the table when Keaton's Bruce Wayne is introduced. Apparently there's a deleted scene that's on the Blu-ray that goes more in depth about why he retired. I think that's a scene that really needed to be in this film and shouldn't have been left out. I think sometimes writers forget how driven Bruce Wayne is in his war on crime. Batman isn't like Spider-Man. He doesn't strain against being a crime fighter. He chose to not have a life outside of his alter ego because it would just distract him from his mission. Bruce Wayne's life is centered around being Batman, so for Bruce Wayne to walk away from Batman, he needs to have a really good excuse. There's versions of Batman where he's so beaten up he needs an exoskeleton to get around, and he's still active as Batman. The animated series got it right. In Batman of the Future, that's Batman Beyond for you guys in the States, it literally took him having a heart attack and pulling a gun on a criminal before he chose to just hang it up. And that made total sense for the character. I'm just saying that if you're going to introduce a Batman who's retired, then elaborate on that. Don't just skip over it with a throwaway line of dialogue. Having said all that though, there's 3 small scenes with Keaton I have to mention that I feel do some nice subtle character building for this version of Batman. The first is after Supergirl is rescued and Bruce is stitching up his arm. He smiles when he's doing it. It's a small scene, but it's effective. It tells you a lot about his character without saying anything at all. It shows that he missed this life and he feels alive now that he's back in it again. The next one is during the rescue of Supergirl. Batman has this small flip phone computer gadget that he uses to hack a computer to get through a door. I like this scene. Batman using a gadget that's this outdated shows you how long he's been retired. This scene is played for laughs, but it's a subtle way of showing you that this guy is from another era. The last thing I want to mention is where Bruce opens his secret bookcase compartment and you get to see all the different batsuits this guy has used over the years. Side note on this, it's a real shame we didn't actually get to see Keaton in one of these. I would have preferred to have seen him in one of these than the one he actually ends up with in the film. I get the directors wanted to keep the nostalgia factor of having him in a suit that's close to what he wore in Returns, but still, these suits are brilliant, and unlike anything we've ever seen in a Batman film before, I would have actually liked to have seen him move around in one of these in live action. Like the other scenes I mentioned, you learn something about this version of Batman from seeing all of these costumes. You see that this guy must have had a long career as Batman, had a lot of adventures in a lot of different places. It points to the character having had a pretty rich history. Like I said, these are small scenes, but I like this kind of stuff, learning information about characters from the way they act and the equipment they use. I prefer learning information from characters in this way than through just expository dialogue. I would have liked if this film had a little bit more of this kind of stuff. Sasha Calle as Supergirl is great. Like with Keaton, my only gripe is that I would have liked to have seen more of her here. Calle's Supergirl is a totally different version of Supergirl from the ones we've seen before, and while usually totally reinventing a character would annoy me, I think it works really well here. As a general rule, I'm not a fan of Kryptonians being straight up killers, but here I understand why Kara would be one. She's been held in captivity captivity in some awful conditions her whole life by some really bad people and only shown cruelty. So for me, this version of Supergirl being a killer gets a pass. Sadly though, Kaye's Supergirl gets the least to do of all the characters that get introduced in this film. She only gets a handful of dialogue and her story feels really rushed, and then bang, she's dead. And that's a real shame because she's a character I would have loved to have seen develop more. There was one other returning cast member that flew under the radar for a lot of people that I was really interested in seeing, Anjay Traua. I really liked her Feora in Man of Steel, even though we got very little of her there too. Her scenes were one of the few things I really liked about that film. She had this great design, she had this commanding presence, and this really cool brutal fighting style. She looked at human beings as if they were insects. For me, more so than Zod, Feora was the best villain in Man of Steel, so I was genuinely excited when I heard she was being brought back for this film, but they don't do anything with her here, which is such a big miss. Honestly, for as little as Zod gets to do in this film, I would have preferred if she just took Michael Shannon's place altogether. So while I'm saying a lot of nice things about The Flash, I have to bring up the biggest problem I had with it, and you can probably guess what that is already if you've seen the trailers. Yes, it's the CGI. I feel this is something that can be said about every major superhero blockbuster now, but man, the CGI is distractingly awful in some places. Some shots are actually rendered really well, but the Speed Force scenes in this film are PlayStation 2 era cutscenes, some of the worst I've seen in a film, and I'm including Black Panther in that. In the finale we get this sequence with a ton of cameo appearances from some older DC films, and man, when the CGI looks this bad, then just don't include it in your film. You could easily cut these cameos from the film and it wouldn't make any difference at all. It's one of those cases where someone needed to make an executive decision and just say no, we're not bringing back these classic versions of these characters only to render them this poorly. You've got Christopher Reeve and Helen Slater as Superman and Supergirl. That sounds amazing. Like Christopher Reeve as Superman, the GOAT, the best ever. So it should be flawless CGI or it shouldn't be there at all. Same with George Reeves and the others. Unless you can do these guys justice, just don't do it. In this case, honestly, it would have been a much better idea to get some of the actors who are still around to do some of the cameos, like Brandon Routh as Superman. You don't need CGI for that, you can just put him in the suit. Get Tyler Hoechlin in as Superman. That would have been great, and it would have been some cross-promotion for Superman and Lois. The same with Grant Gustin as the Flash, who was totally absent here for some reason. I'm sure he would have done it. Could have gotten John Wesley Shipp back as the Flash too. All of these would have been great cameos. My point is that there were better options available here, and they still went with these CGI cameos. You know man, there is something seriously broken in the Hollywood system that CGI is now worse than it was 15 years ago. When CGI is this bad, it kills the magic of these films. It ruins what should be great cinematic moments, like seeing all the Spider-Men swinging together in No Way Home. That's a great scene. It would have been an all-timer if the effects weren't so rushed though. The CGI, not all of the time mind you, but a lot of the time here looks like pre-viz work, like the concept animation that CGI artists used to build real CGI sequences with. It's just such a shame. I really like this film and there's some really great concept action sequences here that could have been great if the CGI wasn't so awful. When the CGI is this bad, it actively degrades the end product. This film deserved better CGI, and people deserve to see the Flash running in all his glory for his first big screen outing. This film cost $200+ million to make. There really isn't an excuse for this. Outside of the CGI, I do have another complaint that's bordering on a nitpick with this film. It's the way the director sometimes shoots Batman, the both of them. Okay, so I'll need to explain this one. We get an action scene with Ben Affleck's Batman chasing down some bad guys on a Batcycle. It's the first big action scene in the film. Outside of the CGI in some places, it's a pretty good scene. You get to see the Batcycle pull off some cool stunts, you get to see Batman use some of the cycle's gadgets. It's cool, but where I was really taken out of this scene was at the very end, when they just have Affleck's Batman standing in broad daylight on a bridge, and it just looks strange. And it's not the choice of costume either. The new blue-grey suit looks great, it's the lighting. The costume is just too exposed. I also noticed this in Whedon's Justice League as well, during the Superman resurrection scene. You see, Batman's suit isn't like Superman or Spider-Man's. Not all of them, but a lot of the Batman costumes are meant to be filmed under low light or in a lot of darkness. That makes sense, right, considering Batman usually works at night. But here, when you start lighting up Batman's suit from every angle, sometimes it's just not going to look right. Now don't get me wrong, you can film a Batsuit in daylight or under bright lights and have it work. The nightmare sequence in Batman v Superman is a great example. Great costume design, and it 100% works here. here as well in The Dark Knight Rises. But there's a few scenes in The Flash where Muschietti doesn't get it quite right and the costume just looks kind of out of place in the environment it's in, and this affects Keaton's costume as well. Muschietti does pull off some good shots with Keaton's suit in daylight. This one here is really good. Also, this shot where Batman is fighting none is great as well. It looks badass here, but when you zoom in on it, like when Keaton's Batman is in the cockpit of the Batplane in broad daylight, there's just too much exposure on it and it looks off. This particular Batsuit can work in daylight like I've shown, but you just need to get the right lighting and angle on it sometimes to maximize the effect of it. Speaking about the costumes, the Flash's new suit, yeah, I'm not a fan of this one. Sometimes when I see it from afar, like here, I think it looks good, but then there's a close-up of it and it just looks off. It's got all these light lines on it. The headpiece isn't made from the same material as the rest of the costume, which doesn't work. It's got too many different textures all over it playing off each other. It's over-designed. You don't need any of this stuff on the Flash's costume. This costume looks fine from afar because you don't see any of this stuff. Less is more with some costumes, and the Flash's costume is probably one of the easiest to translate to the screen. The Flash's costume should be more like Spider-Man's. One piece, form-fitting, and all made from the same material. Some of the costumes on the Flash TV series have not been great, and that's being nice about it. But in season 3 we got one really nice one that for some reason was abandoned almost straight away. This one here. This is a good Flash costume. It's not overly designed, there's nothing unnecessary on it. It's got the classic color scheme, it just works. Something like this would have been way better. I think this film being as good as it is kind of a miracle. I mean, this film is the product of 2 upper management changes at Warner Brothers and an acquisition. For about a year I was pretty positive this film was never going to get released, no lie. Once the deadline was pushed out by almost a year and Backer was cancelled, I was positive Warner Brothers were going to scrap this thing. From what I've heard online, this film has gone through some pretty heavy script changes and reshoots. The reason I think this film works so well despite all those changes is that the writers stuck really close to the emotional core of the film, which is Barry's goal to save his mom and dad. It's a pretty simple premise. The focus isn't Barry fighting a supervillain. I love all these pseudo-sarcastic comments online from people saying,
"Finally the Flash is going to have a film where he fights his arch-nemesis, General Zod, lol."
Zod is a repercussion of Barry's actions in this film. He's not the big bad. In fact, the Flash and Zod don't even have any screen time together in this film as far as I can remember. You could maybe say the Dark Flash is the big bad in this film, but I think that's being generous. No, really, this film doesn't have a big bad. It's a film about a guy trying to undo a tragedy and making things worse in the process. Speaking of the Dark Flash, I actually really liked what Christina Hodson did here with this character. So the younger version of Barry Allen basically refuses to let Batman and Supergirl die and keeps running back in time to save them, but because their deaths are a fixed intersection in this reality, it's actually impossible to prevent them from dying, but he still keeps trying. And what's cool about this is that every time he tries, he gets torn up by more and more shrapnel from the battle. And because time basically doesn't matter to a speedster, he spends what looks like 40 years trying to find a way to save them, and it drives him insane. And when you see the Dark Flash suddenly burst out of a time portal, it's kind of shocking seeing him now as this total monster when he looked fine just seconds ago. I just thought that was actually a really cool reveal and well done. So speaking of reveals, the last big one at the end, George Clooney's return as Bruce Wayne. Loved it. It was spoiled for me months ago like pretty much everything else in this film, but it's a really great cameo, and if I hadn't been spoiled, it would have really shocked me. I think this cameo is actually a great setup for a Flash sequel. I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here for a minute, but bear with me. I've always thought Clooney, like Affleck, never got a proper opportunity with Batman. So Clooney showing up at the end of The Flash, that's something I've actually wanted to see for years. I've wanted to see Clooney come back as an older Bruce Wayne. Now I don't know if this was just a throwaway cameo or if Muschietti actually planned to develop this idea more in a sequel. I guess we'll never know, but deep down I believe if you put Clooney in a batsuit again for another film and make the character darker with a bit more edge and have it set in a new continuity, people would love it. Clooney 100% has the chops for it. I mean, he practically is Bruce Wayne in real life anyway. Clooney's characterization of Batman was a mistake in Batman and Robin, but honestly, it could be the easiest fix for Warner Brothers to take this version of Batman, a version that everyone makes jokes about, and turn him into a badass in the sequel to this film. That would be one of the best redemption stories in Hollywood. George Clooney coming back as an older, grislier Batman, and people loving it. I want to see that, man, for no other reason than I'm just sick of everyone making the same stupid jokes about Clooney's Batman for years now. And also, the jokes about Clooney's batsuit having nipples are so old, man. Every time anyone brings up Clooney's Batman, the next line is always some tired joke about the costume. If you're a guy who thinks this is the funniest thing ever, Congratulations. Clooney's Batman costume wasn't even the first costume to have the nipples. That was the Batman Forever costume worn by Val Kilmer. It's been 26 years. It's time to move on from it. It actually kind of bums me out that we won't see a sequel to The Flash due to its box office. I honestly think it deserves one. There's potential here for more, and it's actually really sad that this is probably the last we'll see of The Flash for a long time. In a way, The Flash kind of reminds me of James Gunn's The Suicide Squad, another great franchise with so much potential that no one will get to experience now because of the low box office numbers. It kind of leaves a sour taste that this really is the last we'll see from a lot of these characters. If you liked Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman, this is probably the last you'll see of her, a 2-minute cameo before she flies away. If you like Ben Affleck as Batman, you get a decent action scene that's hamstrung by some poor CGI, and then one brief scene later on, and then bang, he's literally blinked out of existence at the end. And worse still, if you liked Henry Cavill as Superman, you don't even get a 2-minute cameo like Wonder Woman did. You get nothing. And that's really sad if you like these characters. The main cast that started this whole thing don't get any big moments or a nice farewell. No character gets an old man Steve moment like in Endgame. They just kind of appear for a minute or two and then they're gone, and that's it. I know this film didn't have any obligation to end any of these characters' stories or anything like that. I'm just pointing out that it's kind of a sad note to go out on, like with a whimper instead of a bang. I thought if The Flash was a big hit, these characters would be brought back in a sequel, even with James Gunn's reboot plans, but after this, I think Gunn is probably just going to cut any connective tissue between his new universe and the DCEU, so this film really does mark the end for a lot of these characters. WB actually have a good film here despite all the corporate bullshit and meddling. The kind of film they should have been making all this time, honestly. WB cranked out this one good film right at the end, and it's like, did you enjoy that? Well, too bad if you did, because that's it. There'll never be another one. The DC Extended Universe experiment kind of ends how it began, with a ton of potential that will ultimately go unrealized. So I hope you guys like this video. I'm a little late putting this one together. Things have been kind of crazy lately. So yeah, The Flash. It's a good film. I enjoyed it. I've seen a lot of people rip it to shreds online, and honestly I think that's a little bit harsh. Check this one out for yourself. Who knows, maybe you'll like it. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching.